and Tappy tried to hide each leg behind the other, which was a difficult thing to do. But old King Barley had eyes like gimlets under his bushy brow, and nothing escaped them. Semolina, he roared, what is the band of your hat stitched on behind for? Surely enough Semmo had stitched it on the wrong way round. In his confusion, he dropped the hat and showed the large rent in his coat, which of course attracted old King Barley's attention. Tappy picked up the hat and used it to cover his unclad legs, which thereby escaped notice. But both brothers were overwhelmed with confusion when old Barley said, you dreadful twins can never keep yourselves neat. Now do sit down and try to keep out of mischief. Dear me, this is most distressing, murmured Tappy to his brother. Do let us sit somewhere where I can hide my legs. So they sat down quietly on the edge of a cucumber frame by the side of a little dwarf who had come on a visit from the Highlands of Scotland. His name was Mac. He spoke with a delightful Scottish accent and had been sent by Craigorm, the chief of the Grampian dwarfs, to learn the newest method of cultivating barley. The twins found Mac's conversation most interesting, and they ate their tea so carefully and behaved so nicely that old King Barley began to cast approving and kindly looks at them. He could not see Tappy's legs, for a rock stood in the way. But suddenly something happened. With a wild yell from Semmo and Tappy, and a shriek of Hexers from Mac, the three dwarfs toppled over backwards. They crashed through the glass of the cucumber frame, crushing to death the young plants inside, and lay in the ruins, waving their legs in the air. The other dwarfs flew to their assistance, and old King Barley himself hauled Tappy out by a leg clothed in a stocking only. What had happened? It was Kate. There she stood, a beaming smile on her face, the clothes peg still fastened to her tail, that tail which she had just flung around the necks of the three dwarfs, thereby pulling them back into the cucumber frame. Those awful twins again, roared old King Barley. You had better go home and mend the clothes you have got and search for the clothes you haven't got. You can take that ridiculous cow with you. So Semmo and Tappy went sadly down the hill, again followed by Kate. Dear me, murmured Tappy, this is most distressing. Shall we ever be invited to tea again? And that's the end of part 1. Part 2. The story of a sneeze. And Buster's back again. Mac and Giaant, two of the Scottish dwarfs, lived in a hut nearest to the river, and they came running up one morning to Semmo and Tappy to tell them what they had seen. This morning, said Giaant, we saw Giant Peppercorn leave his cave by the river and go to the windmill on the hill. When he came back, he was carrying under each arm a sack of flour, which he stowed away in his storehouse. We are on our way to tell King Barley about it. Off ran Giaant and Mac in their little red Scotch bonnets to relate the story to the King of Barley Hills. The next day, old King Barley summoned the dwarfs to a council at the Ring of Rocks. All agreed that it was a difficult thing for dwarfs to deal with a giant. No conclusion had been arrived at when the council broke up, and the dwarfs went to their homes with heavy hearts. Mac and Giaant were particularly downhearted, for their hut was close to the caves and the rivers. Dear Semolina, said Janek, do you think that we could arrange a signal so that you and Tapioca would know when we were safe? Certainly, said Semmo. This is There's a very high walnut tree by our hut, and I can see your door from the top of it. I will climb up the tree at noon every day, and if you make no sign, we will come to help you. Samo and Tappy had only one bed, and they did not like sleeping side by side. So one slept at one end of the bed and one at the other. They blew out the candle, but they could not go to sleep. Semo said, Tappy, Semo said Tappy at last, in the darkness, how will you climb the walnut tree? It's too high. Kate, our brown cow, will help me, said Semo. They were very fond of her, for she was very lovable. I'm trying to think of how we can get rid of giant peppercorn, said Tappy. If you will take your heel out of my eye, I think too, said Semo. They both thought, but they both fell asleep before a plan entered their heads. Next day, Semo called Kate, mounted on her back by swarming up her tail, and climbed the walnut tree. Soon he saw Janek appear at his door and wave his red bonnet. Semo took off his green cap and waved it in reply. All was well. This went on for 3 days, but on the fourth nothing was to be seen. So Semo called Kate, slid down on her back, and sat there thinking hard. Tappy stood looking at him. He had just upset a tin of treacle, and it was slowly dripping down his legs into his shoes. Mac and Janek are not at their hut, said Semo at last. Dear me, this is most distressing, said Tappy. Let us go at once. Each dwarf tucked a sharp knife into his belt, and they again laid 3 fir cones on their doorstep. They had pegged Kate to the clothesline by her tail as usual, but Kate had a little squirrel friend who often helped her on occasions like this. So, a few minutes later, Kate was following them, the clothes peg still hanging to her tail. The twins reached the hut of the Grampian dwarfs. They had evidently been baking scones, for a bowl of dough stood ready and a packet of raisins had been upset on the table. Look, whispered Semo, pointing at the floor. A long dribbling track of white flour was plainly to be seen leading out of the hut towards the river. He's taken the sack of flour, whispered Tappy, and he's taken Mac and Janek too. Without a word, they crept down to the river. A few minutes later, Kate arrived, put her nose in the bowl to smell the dough, and with 3 loud sneezes, a face smothered with flour, she followed the twins to Giant Peppercorn's cave. It was growing dusk. Outside the cave stood an enormous pair of top boots. Semmo softly touched his brother and got inside one of them. Tappy climbed into the other. From the inside of the cave, they could hear Mac and Janek crying. But where was Giant Peppercorn? The dusk grew duskier. The river flowed just before the cave, deep and dark, and fog arose from it. At last, out of the cave came a huge lumbering form. It was Giant Peppercorn. He kicked his top boots over as he passed. Semo fell out, but Tappy stuck fast because his legs were smeared with treacle. Giant Peppercorn strode forward to the bank of the river and stood looking into it. Suddenly there was a roar like a cannon. A shoo! Giant Peppercorn gave such a jump that he fell head over heels into the river with a splash that soaked the cave. Kate! Screamed Semo. Kate it was, making the most horrid noises as you do if you choke with flour and water and sneeze at the same time. Tappy, screamed Semmo. I'm stuck in the boot, wailed Tappy. Dear me, this is most distressing. Kate, dear, do come and help me. As soon as she could see for sneezes, Kate ripped the boat up with her horns, and Tappy rolled out a fearful mess of treacle and water. Meanwhile, Semmo had found Mac and Janet bound hand and foot. They told him where to find a light, and he cut their bonds. They determined to go all together to the twins' hut. Kate lowered her head so that Semmo and Janet could each hold a horn. Tappy and Mac held on by her tail and finally arrived at their hut. Next morning they set off to report to old King Barley. They were a sorry sight. Mac and Janet wore bandages around their ankles and wrists, where giant peppercorn's ropes had galled them. Semmo had a black eye from his fall out of the top boot. Tappy had tied up a grazed knee. Kate had a sore throat, so they rubbed it with camphorated oil and tied a little shawl round her neck. When this procession appeared before old King Barley, he scowled, opened his lips to make some remark about those awful twins, but when he heard their story, he summoned all the dwarfs. He told them the history of Giant Peppercorn's end, and he shook hands with Semmo and Tappy. He hung a silver medal around Kate's neck when the twins returned to their own hut. All the other little dwarfs ran beside them and cheered them, and Giant Peppercorn was never seen again. So that's the end of that story. And here's the end of Giant Peppercorn. Well, I hope you like that. Buster has settled himself in the corner. I don't think he's very interested in the story at all. But I'm sure you all are, because Buster can't understand English. But anyway, here's an interesting painting. And if you've noticed, I've been changing the paintings every day. They are paintings that are done by my wife. And she likes to paint. So if you're interested, you can make remarks about that also, or comment about that in the comment section. Have a nice day. Till next time. Bye bye from me and Buster.